Our application is correctly showing no results when we're logged out. However, if we log in and try to refresh, we're still seeing no results. So what's going on here? Let's make this a little bit clearer by importing our supabase client from utils/supabase server. And now down in our loader, let's make a request to supabase to get our current session. So we can do this by calling supabase.auth.getSession, and then let's also return this new session from our loader, which means in our component, we can now destructure this from what we get back from our useLoader data hook. And then let's console log an object that prints out our server session. And then after our useState here, let's add another useEffect, which we need to also bring in from React. Since useEffect runs client-side, we're going to use that singleton instance of supabase that we declared above. And we're just basically doing the same thing. We're calling .auth.getSession, and then when we get back that session, we're just console logging it out, but this time with the key client, just so that we can help distinguish that from our server session here. Let's save this and then refresh our application and open up the console. And now if we look at the state of our server's session, we'll see that it's set to null. However, if we have a look at our client, we'll see our user's session data. And that's because by default, Supabase stores our session information in local storage. However, our loader function in Remix gets executed on the server, which has no idea about local storage. If we want the server to also be able to use our Supabase session, we need to install the auth helpers package. So let's type npm install @supabase/auth-helpers-remix. And once that's finished, we can run our development environment again. And so now to create a Supabase client on the server, we want to import the create server client function from @supabase/auth-helpers-remix. And let's call that function to create our new Supabase client. And since this is going to use cookies instead of local storage to manage the user's session, we need to refactor this file to export out a function so we can take in a request and a response. And the type for our request is going to be a request, and the type for our response is going to be, you guessed it, response with a capital R. We then need to pass these values across to our create server client function. And now TypeScript tells us that we need to fix up our imports. So let's come up to the top of our root.tsx file and refactor this to instead bring in a function called create server supabase. And then down in our loader function, we can create a new Supabase client by calling our create server supabase function, which then needs to take in a request and a response. So we can get our request from our loader arguments here. However, our response, we're going to need to create above. So let's say const response is equal to a new response. Now this Supabase client may need to refresh the access token when making a request to Supabase. So it needs to be able to set cookie headers in order to update the session that's used both across the server and the client. Therefore, whenever we're creating a Supabase client on the server side, so in our loaders or actions, we need to remember to return headers that are set to these response.headers. Since our server Supabase client is now using cookies for authentication, we also need to use cookies for the client that's used across our components. And so rather than calling create client, we want to call create browser client, which also comes in from that auth helpers package, which means we can also remove our create client import from Supabase.js and move our import statement from our auth helpers above our types. We also need to update our import in routes index.tsx and update the import to be a create server Supabase function. We then want to bring in our request from our loader args, create a new empty response, create a new Supabase client by calling create server Supabase and passing it our request and response. And then we need to remember to use the JSON helper, which comes in from remix run/node to send back our messages and then also send those headers from our response. And now when we go back to the browser and refresh, we can force the user to go through that full GitHub authentication flow again by going over to our OAuth application settings in GitHub and revoking all user tokens. We click I understand, revoke all user tokens. And now back in our Remix application, when we click login, we'll be sent through that authorization flow as if this is the first time that we've signed into the application. And now if we refresh, we should again see those messages from Supabase. And if we open up the console and have a look at our server session, we should see that it now contains our logged in user's session. So to recap, Supabase.js uses local storage to store the user's session. Local storage only exists within the user's browser, so therefore our loaders, which are running on the server, don't have access to the user's session. Therefore, we used the Supabase auth helpers package for Remix to swap out the storage mechanism to use cookies instead of local storage. This means our currently signed in user's session is now available server-side in our loaders and actions, and the same shared session is now available anywhere within our component's client-side. Our application is only showing messages to users that are signed in. However, when we sign out, you'll see that we're still seeing these messages and we need to refresh before seeing that new state. And then again, if we log in, the same thing happens. And that's because the logging in process redirects us to this page before GitHub has completed its OAuth process. So we're loading our page before our auth state has actually changed. This will cause Remix to call our loader, which attempts to go to Supabase and get all the messages that this user is allowed to see, but Supabase says, well, this person isn't signed in, so you get an empty array. Then that OAuth flow from GitHub completes, and our user is now signed in, but nothing's telling Remix to go and call that loader again to get that authenticated data from Supabase. So we need to detect when our Supabase auth state changes and tell Remix we need to go and call all of those loaders again and get fresh data. Thankfully, Supabase gives us a hook to do exactly that. So back up in our root.tsx file, let's go down to our component and we can get rid of these console logs now. And since we're no longer using this use effect, we can repurpose it to call supabase.auth.onAuth state change. And then this takes a function which will be passed an event and a session anytime the user's auth state changes. So then we want to check if our session has an access token and its value is different to our server access token, which is a variable we can declare above. And we can set this to be equal to our server's session's access token, which is what we got back from our loader here. So if our new access token that we've received client-side doesn't match our server's access token, then it means that the data that our user is seeing is now out of sync. And so we need to call our loaders again. And we can do this using a revalidator. So let's create one of those above by calling the useRevalidator hook, which comes in from @remixrun/react. And then back down in our callback function, we can say revalidator.revalidate, and this is going to automatically call any active loaders on the page. Now, since onAuth state change creates a new subscription, we need to make sure we clean this up in our use effect. So we get back a data object, and this data object has a subscription on it. And so to clean this up, we can return an arrow function from use effect, and in here call subscription.unsubscribe. And lastly, our use effect now has an external dependency on Supabase, our server access token, and also our revalidator. So let's add those to our dependency array. And now when we head back to the browser and refresh, we'll see we've still got that empty state. But now when we log in, we'll see the messages we're meant to see as a logged in user. And again, when we log out, we'll see that empty state without needing to refresh. Let's add the ability for our users to send a message. So back over in our routes index.tsx file, we want to render out a form with a capital F, and this one comes in from @remixrun/react. The method for this form is going to be post, and inside our form we want an input box, which is of type text. We'll give it the name of message, and then add a button with the type of submit and the text send. The method of this form being anything other than get means that Remix will try to submit this form to an action for this route. And so we'll declare that above our loader here with the same boilerplate for creating a server-side Supabase client. So we take in the request from our action args and we can fix up the import to come in from @remixrun/node. We then create an empty response and then use that to create our server Supabase client, and then send a response from our action with those Supabase headers set. We can then call object.fromEntries and pass it a call to await our request.formData, which will give us a big object with key value pairs for all of our different form inputs. So we can then destructure our message and then await a call to supabase, telling it from the messages table, we want to insert a new row, setting the content column to be the value of our message. And we just need to wrap that in a call to string to ensure we are getting a string value for our message. Now, TypeScript is not happy here because it's expecting us to also pass across a user ID. We're going to fix this in Supabase itself in a moment, so we can ignore this one. Now, if something goes wrong while we're trying to insert this value, we'll get back an error. And then if we have an error, then we just want to console log it out. Now, we could work out who the currently signed in user is and pass this along with our request to insert a new message. But since Supabase already manages auth and therefore knows who this user is, we can actually implement this in Supabase itself. So if we come over to the table editor and look at our messages table, we can edit our user ID column. And if we scroll down, we can set the default value to be auth.uid. And this is a special function that we get in Supabase that will return us the currently signed in user, or in this case, the user who is currently trying to insert a new record. We can now click Save to update our column. And now if we go back to VS Code, we'll still be seeing that type error. That's because we need to regenerate our types. So if we quit our currently running server and then run our command to regenerate our types, we can then start our development server again. And if we restart our TypeScript server, we should see that TypeScript is happy again. However, if we go back to the browser and actually try to insert a message, so let's say new message, and then open up our console and go over to the network tab before we click send, when we try to write this new message to Supabase, we're getting a 200 here, but if we refresh the page, we're not actually going to see that new message. And if we have a look at our server console, we're going to see this error here. New row violates row level security policy for table messages. And this is because in Supabase, we've enabled row level security for our messages table. And we've written a policy for select, but all insert, update, and delete requests are automatically being denied. So let's create a new policy for insert. The name is going to be users can insert their own messages. We want to enable the insert action. The target roles are again going to be authenticated because a message relies on there being a signed in user. And now for our with check expression, we want to make sure that the user ID column in the messages table is equal to whatever we get back from our auth.uid function, which again gives us the currently signed in user trying to perform this action. So this just means that a user won't be able to send a message as someone else. So let's click review and then save policy to run that SQL on our database. And now if we go back to our application and try to send that message again, we'll see it appears at the bottom here. And when we refresh, this information is persisted in the database, which we can also confirm by going to our table editor and then looking at our messages. And we can see that new row has been successfully written to the database with the currently signed in user attached. Currently, users can send messages, but the UI is only updated